Everyone has an opinion about millennials. They're lazy. They're entitled. They killed the napkin industry, the housing market, and apparently also chain restaurants. Pick your headline. There's no shortage of takes. But here's the thing nobody stops to ask. Why are they the way they are? Because if you actually look at the psychology, the research, the developmental patterns, the specific historical pressures they grew up inside, a very different picture emerges. Not a generation that was handed too much, a generation that was promised too much at exactly the wrong moment in history. Born roughly between 1981 and 1996, millennials are among the most studied generations alive, and somehow still consistently mischaracterized. So let's actually look at what the research says. They were raised inside a pressure cooker. Picture this. It's 1995. You're 10 years old, and the adults around you have one message, delivered constantly, in slightly different packaging. You are special. You can be anything. The world is waiting for you. Trophies for participation, gold stars for showing up, parents at every recital, every game, every parent-teacher conference. This wasn't neglect dressed up differently. It was the opposite. Total consuming involvement. Researchers call this the self-esteem movement, a wholesale shift in parenting philosophy that peaked through the 1980s and 90s. The thinking was sincere. If children believe in themselves, they'll achieve more. So an entire generation was told repeatedly that they were exceptional. The psychological fallout was subtle but significant. Research published in Psychological Science found that praise disconnected from actual performance doesn't reliably build genuine confidence. In many cases, it builds what researchers call contingent self-esteem, a sense of worth that depends on external validation rather than internal competence. Effects vary by context, and not all praise works this way. But for many who grew up inside this cultural moment, receiving it so broadly and consistently, the cumulative pattern matters. The child raised in this environment doesn't always learn, I am capable. Sometimes they learn, I am capable when someone tells me I am. That distinction follows many millennials into classrooms, offices, and relationships. It's not entitlement. It's a quiet, persistent uncertainty about whether they're actually good enough when nobody is watching. Then the world shifted. They graduated into a country that was still just barely working the way it was supposed to. Then September 11th happened. Then a decade of war and rising costs. And then, just as the oldest millennials were finding their footing, 2008. The financial crisis restructured their entire relationship with the future. Research from the Pew Research Center documents that millennials who entered the workforce during the recession experienced significant lasting wage penalties stretching across years, sometimes longer, depending on field and circumstance. It wasn't a uniform experience across the board, but for a large portion of this generation, the economic damage was real and prolonged. Many did everything they were told to do. Went to college, often into serious debt, because that's what the adults said. Worked unpaid internships, because the market demanded it. Then graduated into an economy that had quietly moved the goalposts. The psychological term for this is goal blockage. When sustained investment in a goal meets systematic obstruction. The research shows this produces more than disappointment. It generates a specific kind of anxiety rooted in the gap between expectation and reality. For many millennials, that gap was enormous, and they were told simultaneously that it was their own fault. The anxiety question? Surveys, including repeated reports from the American Psychological Association, show that millennials self-report higher stress than older generations. That pattern is real and documented. But two things are worth noting. Older generations may underreport stress due to cultural norms around stoicism. And more recent data suggests Gen Z now scores higher than millennials on several anxiety measures. So, most anxious generation on record isn't quite the right frame. The picture is more complicated and more fluid than that. What's more accurate is this. Many millennials came of age during compounding economic uncertainty, and the psychological effects are well documented. Significant student debt, a real aggregate burden, even if individual experience varies widely, combined with increasingly unaffordable housing in major cities, and a labor market with a growing shift toward contract and freelance arrangements, created lasting economic stress for a substantial portion of this generation. What that stress produces psychologically is a pattern of heightened uncertainty sensitivity, a tendency to stay braced for the next disruption, because the last several arrived without warning, not a clinical condition, more a learned orientation toward the future that makes complete relaxation feel like a risk. From the outside, that looks like excessive caution. From the inside, it looks like experience. Technology didn't spoil them, it shaped them. Millennials are the first generation to grow up alongside the internet, not born into it like Gen Z, but present for its entire construction. They remember both worlds. That gives them a distinctive relationship with technology. They understand it deeply, but they also carry an analog baseline. They know what it means to be bored, to be lost without GPS, to have a conversation nobody recorded. What the internet gave them was psychologically double-edged. Community, yes. But alongside it, comparison at a scale no previous generation had encountered. Social media arrived just as millennials were hitting their 20s, the developmental window when identity is most actively forming. Suddenly, the comparison set wasn't the neighborhood or the school. It was everyone, everywhere, constantly. Social comparison theory is well established. Measuring yourself against people who appear to be doing better, reliably, predicts reduced life satisfaction. Research linking heavy social media use to increased anxiety is consistent, though causation is still actively studied. What's clear is the structural position many millennials found themselves in. The platforms associated with anxiety were also the ones their careers, social lives, and communities ran on. For many, stepping away entirely wasn't a realistic option, so they learned to live inside the contradiction. The 2019 Cigna Loneliness Study found that younger adults, including millennials, reported higher loneliness than older generations, more digital contact, less felt connection. The two things turned out not to be the same. What they actually value. Here's where the entitled narrative breaks down. Research on millennial workplace preferences shows they prioritize meaning, flexibility, and purpose, alongside salary and stability. That second part often disappears from the headline. They want financial security just as much as previous generations. They've simply learned not to sacrifice everything else pursuing it, having watched that trade fail for the people ahead of them. Psychologists distinguish between extrinsic motivation, driven by money and status, and intrinsic motivation, driven by engagement and purpose. Neither is uniquely millennial, but a generation that watched institutional loyalty go unrewarded had particular reason to invest in the kind of motivation that can't be eliminated by a restructuring announcement. It's also worth noting, this isn't a purely generational trait. Research shows that when traditional rewards become unreliable, people across generations shift toward intrinsic motivation. Context shapes values. It always has. The parenting paradox. The millennials who were overparented are now raising children of their own. Many are consciously trying to correct the pattern, pulling back excessive praise, encouraging independence, resisting the helicopter instinct. But they're doing it inside an information environment that generates new parenting anxieties faster than old ones can be resolved. Every decision arrives with competing studies, social media commentary, and a visible audience with opinions. The generation raised on external validation is trying to parent without relying on it, while being watched constantly by an internet that never stops weighing in. They want to raise resilient children. They're working through their own things at the same time. What gets missed? Here's what disappears in every think piece about avocado toast and participation trophies. This is a generation shaped substantially by timing rather than character. Jun Twenge, a psychologist who has studied generational differences extensively, has argued that millennial struggles are largely explained by when they hit key life stages during periods of compounding disruption, rather than relative stability. Her work isn't without debate among researchers, but the core argument that timing matters enormously is well supported by the economic data. They adapted, built multiple income streams because one stopped being reliable, created community online because the physical infrastructure of community had thinned, kept moving, largely without public acknowledgement, while absorbing blame for conditions they inherited. They didn't get the world they were promised. They built a different version of a life inside the one they actually got. That's not entitlement. That's adaptation. And the research, when you read it carefully, backs that up. If this gave you something to think about, subscribe for more deep dives into the psychology behind the generations we think we understand.